They say fate never knocks twice, but sometimes it only takes one quiet moment for two completely different lives to begin moving toward the same future. The rain had arrived without warning, turning the streets of downtown Boston into a shimmering maze of reflections beneath gray afternoon skies. People hurried beneath umbrellas, weaving around puddles with the practiced rhythm of a city that refused to slow down. Grace Mitchell pulled the hood of her light blue raincoat over her blonde hair as she stepped out of the neighborhood bookstore where she worked 6 days a week. Tucked carefully inside her canvas tote was a sketchbook she carried everywhere, its pages filled with charcoal drawings of strangers, old buildings, and dreams she never quite admitted out loud. Someday, she hoped those sketches would become the foundation of her own little illustration studio. Someday felt painfully far away, but hope was cheaper than rent, and somehow it always fit inside her bag. She checked her watch and sighed. Her bus would not arrive for another 20 minutes, leaving just enough time to grab a cup of coffee from the small cafe across the street. As she waited for the traffic light to change, a sudden splash echoed nearby. A sleek black sedan had rolled into a pothole hidden beneath the rainwater, sending muddy water across the sidewalk. Several pedestrians groaned in annoyance before continuing on without looking back. The driver stepped out, shaking his head with a quiet laugh that sounded more amused than frustrated. He wore dark jeans, a charcoal jacket, and rain-soaked sneakers that looked surprisingly ordinary for someone driving such an expensive car. Grace noticed him kneel beside the front tire, studying something near the wheel with an expression that suggested he was trying to solve a puzzle rather than panic. Most people simply walked past. One businessman even muttered that he should have bought a better car before disappearing beneath his umbrella. Grace hesitated for only a heartbeat before crossing the sidewalk toward him. "Need an extra pair of eyes?" she asked with a warm smile. The man looked up, slightly surprised. His blue eyes held a calmness that immediately caught her attention. "I was hoping someone might know more about cars than I do," he admitted with an embarrassed chuckle. "Turns out expensive vehicles aren't magically immune to potholes." Grace laughed softly. "Trust me, potholes don't care how much a car costs." Together they looked toward the front wheel. The tire appeared intact, but a loose plastic panel beneath the bumper had partially detached after scraping the pavement. It wasn't dangerous, only inconvenient. Grace glanced around before spotting a small hardware store across the block. "Wait here," she said. Before he could object, she hurried through the drizzle and returned a few minutes later carrying a roll of heavy-duty tape she had purchased with the few dollars left in her wallet after paying her monthly utility bill. Kneeling beside him, she carefully helped secure the loose panel. Rain dripped from both of their sleeves as they worked, occasionally laughing whenever the tape refused to cooperate. Finally, the panel held firmly in place. "That should get you wherever you're going," Grace said, brushing damp strands of hair away from her face. The stranger examined their improvised repair and smiled with genuine admiration. "You just saved me from an incredibly awkward afternoon." She shrugged. Sometimes temporary solutions are exactly what people need. For reasons he couldn't explain, those simple words lingered in Ethan Walker's mind. He had spent years surrounded by executives who believed every problem required a $1,000,000 answer. Yet this stranger had solved one with kindness, patience, and less than $10. He reached into his pocket. "At least let me pay you back for the tape." Grace gently shook her head. "No, it's okay. Besides, one day you'll probably help someone else. That'll be enough." Ethan lowered his hand, studying her as the rain softened into a gentle mist. There was no expectation in her voice, no curiosity about who he was, no glance toward the luxury badge on the hood of his car. She simply believed kindness should keep moving from one person to another. A distant church bell chimed across the city as traffic slowly began flowing again. Grace smiled politely, adjusted the strap of her canvas bag, and started walking toward the bus stop without asking for his name. Ethan watched her disappear into the crowd, completely unaware that the woman carrying a weathered sketchbook had just changed something inside him, and neither of them could possibly imagine that this ordinary rainy afternoon would become the first page of a story neither fate nor fortune had ever planned to explain. Grace did not think about the stranger again for the rest of the afternoon, at least not intentionally. Life had a way of pushing gentle moments aside with bills, responsibilities, and clocks that never seemed to slow down. Her apartment sat above an aging laundromat in South Boston, where the pipes groaned every morning and the windows rattled whenever the wind picked up from the harbor. It was not much, but every corner carried pieces of her quiet dreams. Sketches covered one wall with removable tape because she could not afford proper frames. A folding table served as both her dining room and her art desk. Near the window sat a small jar filled with colored pencils worn almost to the end. Grace slipped off her damp shoes, made herself a bowl of tomato soup, and carefully opened her sketchbook before dinner. She had planned to finish an illustration commissioned by a local bakery, but instead she found herself absent-mindedly drawing the outline of a man kneeling beside a damaged car in the rain. She smiled at herself before turning the page. It was silly, she thought. She had spent less than 15 minutes with him. Meanwhile, across the city, Ethan Walker stepped into the top floor of Walker Innovations headquarters. The sleek glass building overlooked Boston Harbor, and every floor reflected the precision that had built one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America. His assistant greeted him with a relieved expression. "The board has been waiting for nearly 30 minutes. Ethan nodded apologetically before walking into the conference room. Around the polished walnut table sat investors, attorneys, and senior executives, each with a stack of reports waiting for his approval. For the next 3 hours they discussed expansion strategies, international partnerships, quarterly projections, and numbers large enough to change entire industries. Ethan answered every question calmly, but his thoughts occasionally drifted somewhere unexpected. He remembered muddy rainwater splashing across the sidewalk. He remembered someone laughing instead of complaining. Most of all, he remembered hearing, "Sometimes temporary solutions are exactly what people need." The sentence sounded strangely wiser than anything discussed inside the boardroom. After the meeting finally ended, his longtime friend and chief financial officer, Daniel Brooks, followed him into his office carrying a folder. "You have been unusually quiet today," Daniel observed. Ethan smiled faintly. "Have I?" Daniel laughed. "You approved 6 contracts in record time and spent 5 full minutes staring out the window afterward. That usually means you are thinking about something important." Ethan walked toward the floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the city below. "Tell me something," he said. "When was the last time someone helped you without expecting anything in return?" Daniel considered the question. "Honestly, I cannot remember." Ethan nodded slowly. "Neither can I." Daniel looked genuinely curious, but Ethan only changed the subject and returned to discussing business. Even he could not explain why a stranger's kindness had unsettled him so deeply. Grace's week continued exactly as it always had. She arranged new arrivals at the bookstore each morning, recommended novels to loyal customers, and spent her lunch breaks sketching people who never realized they had become part of her growing collection. An elderly veteran reading near the history section, a young mother helping her son choose his first chapter book, 2 college students laughing over travel guides they could not yet afford to use. Grace believed every face carried a story worth remembering. On Friday afternoon, her manager handed her a small envelope. Inside was payment for the bakery illustrations she had completed the previous month. It was enough to cover groceries and maybe replace the worn soles of her sneakers. She folded the check carefully into her wallet beside a handwritten note she had carried for years. It simply read, "Keep drawing. Someone will see your work someday." Her late father had written those words before he passed away, and no matter how difficult life became, she refused to throw them away. At almost the exact same moment, Ethan sat alone in his office after everyone else had left for the evening. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass as darkness settled over Boston. His phone buzzed with invitations to charity galas, networking dinners, and private events attended by people who always seemed interested in his fortune before they cared about his thoughts. Without thinking, he opened his calendar and canceled every social engagement scheduled for the following weekend. Instead, he searched for one place he had not visited in years, a neighborhood bookstore only a few blocks from where the rainstorm had changed the rhythm of an otherwise ordinary day. He told himself he was only looking for a new novel. Deep down, however, another quiet possibility had already begun taking root. Saturday mornings always carried a different rhythm inside Harbor Page's bookstore. The scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted from the tiny cafe tucked into the corner, while soft jazz floated through the shelves lined with weathered classics and colorful new releases. Grace loved those quiet hours before the afternoon crowds arrived because they reminded her that stories did not simply live inside books. They wandered through the front door every day disguised as ordinary people. She adjusted a display of local authors near the entrance before slipping her sketchbook beneath the checkout counter, promising herself she would spend her lunch break drawing instead of organizing inventory for once. The little notebook had become more than paper and pencil. It held every dream she was still afraid to say aloud. Whenever life felt uncertain, she filled another page instead of giving up. A small brass bell chimed above the entrance just after 10 o'clock. Grace looked up automatically with her usual welcoming smile. For a brief second she froze, standing just inside the doorway, shaking tiny drops of rain. From his navy jacket was the same man she had helped on the sidewalk a few days earlier. Ethan noticed her at almost the exact same moment, and an unmistakable smile spread across his face, the kind that appeared naturally rather than politely. "I was hoping I might run into you again," he admitted as he approached the counter. Grace laughed softly. "That is a surprisingly honest thing to say." He rubbed the back of his neck with quiet embarrassment. "I came looking for a book. At least that is what I told myself." She raised one amused eyebrow. "And what are you telling yourself now?" Ethan glanced around the cozy bookstore before answering. "That maybe fate has a favorite reading spot." Grace could not help smiling. There was something unusually comfortable about talking with him, as if the conversation had simply paused in the rain and resumed exactly where it belonged. "Well," she said, "if you are really here for a book, I should probably do my job." Ethan nodded with exaggerated seriousness. "I could definitely use some professional guidance." She stepped from behind the register and led him through narrow aisles filled with novels, biographies, and travel journals. "What kind of stories do you like?" she asked. Ethan considered the question longer than expected. "Stories about people who quietly change other people's lives." Grace turned toward him with genuine curiosity. "That is oddly specific." "Maybe," he replied, "but I think those are the people we remember longest." She reached for a hardcover resting halfway up a wooden shelf and handed it to him. "Then start with this one. It is about ordinary kindness creating extraordinary consequences." Ethan accepted the book carefully, almost as though the recommendation itself mattered more than the pages inside. As they continued walking, Grace stopped near a display featuring local artists. Framed illustrations hung beside handmade journals created by independent designers from around New England. Ethan noticed the subtle change in her expression. She lingered for only a moment before looking away. "You like drawing, do you not?" he asked. Grace blinked in surprise. "How did you know?" Ethan smiled. "The sketchbook under the counter was a good clue." She laughed, slightly embarrassed. "I guess I am not very mysterious. May I see it someday?" The question caught her off guard. Most people politely acknowledged her hobby before changing the subject. Very few ever asked to see the work itself. She hesitated for a moment before slowly pulling the worn sketchbook from beneath the register. The corners were bent from years of carrying it everywhere. Inside were pencil portraits of strangers, rainy streets, bookstores, coffee cups, old brick buildings, and little moments that most people would never notice. Ethan turned each page carefully, making sure his fingertips never smudged the drawings. Finally, he stopped at an empty page near the back. "Why leave this one blank?" he asked quietly. Grace looked down at the untouched paper and smiled with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. "Because I promised myself I would only use it when something happened that completely changed my life." Ethan closed the sketchbook gently before handing it back. Neither of them realized that the blank page had just become the most important promise in the entire notebook. As the afternoon sunlight slowly broke through the clouds outside, Ethan purchased the novel she had recommended, thanked her for the conversation, and walked toward the exit. Just before opening the door, he turned around with an easy smile. "I never asked your name." "Grace," she answered. "Grace Mitchell." He nodded warmly. "I am Ethan." No last names. No titles. No explanations. Just two strangers who believed they had shared nothing more than another pleasant conversation, while somewhere beyond the bookstore windows, fate quietly continued writing the story that neither of them could yet imagine. The following Tuesday arrived wrapped in clear skies and crisp autumn air, the kind of morning that made Boston feel smaller, warmer, and unexpectedly full of possibility. Grace unlocked the bookstore a few minutes before opening. balancing a cardboard tray of fresh muffins from the bakery next door while humming softly to herself. She had not expected to think about Ethan again, yet every time the little brass bell above the entrance chimed, a small part of her glanced toward the door before reminding herself that coincidences rarely happen twice. She laughed at her own imagination and began arranging the new arrivals on a display table. Around noon, business slowed enough for her lunch break. She carried her sketchbook to the small public park across the street, where colorful leaves drifted lazily across brick walkways, and children laughed from a distant playground, while office workers ate sandwiches beneath old maple trees. Grace chose her favorite bench overlooking a quiet fountain and opened the blank page she had protected for years. She still could not bring herself to draw on it, so she flipped back several pages and began sketching the fountain instead. A familiar voice interrupted her concentration. "I think the real fountain has some competition." Grace looked up with surprised laughter. Ethan stood beside the bench holding 2 paper cups of coffee. "You keep appearing out of nowhere," she said. "I was beginning to suspect the city hired you to follow me." He smiled. "I could say the same thing about you." He held up one of the cups. "I remembered you mentioned tomato soup the other day, so I guessed you might also appreciate good coffee." Grace accepted it with grateful amusement. "That is an oddly specific memory." Ethan shrugged. "I pay attention to interesting conversations." They spent the next hour talking beneath the changing leaves while the city moved quietly around them. Grace told him about growing up in a small coastal town in Maine, where her father repaired fishing boats and encouraged her to draw everything she saw. She described long summers filled with sketching lighthouses, seashells, and neighbors who happily traded homemade cookies for little portraits. Ethan listened carefully, asking questions that made it obvious he truly wanted to understand rather than simply fill the silence. When she finished, she looked at him expectantly. "Your turn." Ethan smiled thoughtfully before staring toward the fountain. "I grew up here in Massachusetts. I have spent most of my adult life working." "Doing what?" she asked. He paused only briefly. "Technology consulting." It was not exactly a lie, but it was far from the whole truth. Grace nodded without pressing further. She had never been interested in measuring people by their careers. Instead, she asked, "Are you happy?" The question caught Ethan completely off guard. Investors asked about profits. Journalists asked about innovation. Executives asked about strategy. No one had asked that simple question in years. He answered honestly, "Some days I think I forgot what that word feels like." Grace looked at him for a long moment before quietly saying, "Maybe happiness is less about finding the perfect life and more about noticing the good moments that already exist." Ethan smiled gently. "You make ordinary sentences sound important." She laughed. "Only because I have had plenty of ordinary days." The afternoon sun slipped lower across the park as shadows stretched over the pathways. Before returning to work, Grace pulled her sketchbook onto her lap. "Hold still for just a minute," she said. Ethan looked puzzled but remained seated. Her pencil moved quickly across the paper with quiet confidence. Within minutes, she turned the notebook around. It was a simple sketch of him sitting beneath the maple tree with one coffee cup resting beside him and a thoughtful expression aimed toward the fountain. Ethan stared at the drawing longer than he expected. No expensive portrait had ever captured him so naturally. It was not the face of a billionaire or a company founder. It was simply the face of a man enjoying an ordinary afternoon. "You are incredibly talented," he said sincerely. Grace felt her cheeks warm. "It is only a sketch." "No," Ethan replied softly. "It is the first time in a very long while that I have looked at myself and recognized the person in the picture." Grace carefully tore the page from the sketchbook and handed it to him. "Then keep it." Ethan accepted the drawing with unexpected care, folding it only enough to slide inside the novel she had recommended days earlier. Neither of them realized they had just exchanged something far more valuable than gifts. She had trusted him with a piece of her dream, and he quietly carried it away like a promise he had no intention of forgetting. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither Grace nor Ethan ever planned, yet neither of them wanted to interrupt. It became almost natural for Ethan to stop by Harbor Pages every Thursday evening after work, always leaving his phone inside his jacket pocket instead of constantly checking it. Grace began setting aside novels she thought he might enjoy, slipping handwritten notes inside the covers explaining why each story mattered to her. Sometimes the notes were only one sentence. Sometimes they filled an entire page. Ethan saved every single one without telling her. For the first time in years, his calendar no longer measured his days entirely by meetings and deadlines. Instead, Thursday afternoons quietly became the favorite part of his week. One Saturday, Grace suggested they visit the Boston Public Garden before the leaves disappeared completely. Ethan arrived wearing the same navy jacket she remembered from the bookstore, blending so naturally into the crowd that no one gave him a second glance. They wandered along winding paths, watching ducks glide across the pond while musicians played acoustic guitar near the footbridge. Grace carried her sketchbook under one arm as always, stopping every few minutes whenever a scene caught her attention. An elderly couple sharing a bench, a little dog chasing fallen leaves, a father teaching his daughter how to feed the ducks without frightening them. Ethan watched her more than he watched the scenery. She noticed beauty where everyone else hurried past it. "You never seem to run out of things to draw," he observed. Grace smiled without looking up from the page. "People think inspiration comes from extraordinary places. I think it comes from paying attention." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe that is why the world feels different when I am with you." Grace looked up, surprised by the quiet honesty in his voice. She felt her heartbeat quicken, but answered with a gentle smile instead of words. They continued walking until they reached a small art fair tucked beneath rows of colorful trees. Local painters, photographers, and illustrators displayed their work beneath white tents while families wandered from booth to booth. Grace slowed almost immediately, admiring every display with genuine excitement. Ethan noticed the mixture of admiration and hesitation in her eyes. "Have you ever shown your own work at one of these?" he asked. Grace laughed softly and shook her head. "Maybe someday. Why not now?" She looked toward one of the artists arranging framed watercolor paintings. "Because dreams can feel much safer inside a sketchbook than hanging on a wall where everyone can judge them." Ethan stood quietly for a moment before saying, "I do not think your fear comes from people judging your drawings. I think it comes from finally discovering how good they really are." Grace blinked at him, unsure how to answer. No one had ever spoken about her talent with such calm certainty. Before she could change the subject, one of the artists accidentally dropped a large portfolio as a gust of wind swept through the fair. Dozens of prints scattered across the walkway. Without hesitation, Grace hurried over to help gather every page before they blew away. Ethan joined her, kneeling beside strangers they had never met. The grateful artist thanked them repeatedly before noticing Grace's sketchbook. "Are you an illustrator?" he asked. Grace smiled modestly. "Just for fun." The artist flipped through several pages after she shyly handed it to him. His expression changed almost immediately. "These belong in a gallery, not hidden inside a notebook." Grace laughed nervously, assuming he was simply being kind, but Ethan watched her carefully. He could see that the compliment reached somewhere deep inside her heart, even if she pretended otherwise. Later that afternoon, they stopped at a small cafe overlooking the Charles River. Sunlight shimmered across the water while sailboats drifted slowly in the distance. Grace stirred her hot chocolate absent-mindedly before asking the question that had quietly lingered for weeks. "Do you ever feel like your life became so busy that you forgot what you originally wanted?" Ethan looked out across the river before answering honestly. "Every day." She nodded as though she had expected that answer. "Then maybe we both need the same reminder." She reached into her tote bag and carefully tore out a tiny piece of paper from the back of an old receipt. Across it she wrote 5 simple words in neat handwriting. "Never stop becoming yourself." She folded the note once and slid it across the table. Ethan accepted it with the same care he had shown every drawing she ever trusted him with. Without realizing it, Grace had just planted another promise into his life, one that would quietly shape every decision he was about to make. While the distance between their two worlds continued shrinking one conversation, one shared smile, and one ordinary afternoon at a time. 3 days later, Boston dressed itself in quiet elegance as the city's annual Community Arts and Innovation Gala prepared to welcome philanthropists, entrepreneurs, educators, and local artists beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Harbor Grand Hotel. Grace had never planned to attend. Earlier that week, the bookstore had received 2 complimentary invitations from a nonprofit literacy foundation thanking Harbor Pages for supporting neighborhood reading programs. Her manager insisted she represent the store. "You spend every day helping people fall in love with stories," he told her with a smile. Tonight you deserve to be part of one. Grace borrowed a simple emerald green dress from her closest friend, carefully pinned her hair into a loose style, and slipped her father's handwritten note into her small evening purse, just as she always did whenever she needed courage. Before leaving home, she stared briefly at the blank page near the back of her sketchbook. Her pencil hovered over the paper before she quietly closed the cover once again. Somehow it still did not feel like the right moment. When she entered the ballroom, she immediately felt out of place. Soft piano music drifted through the room while elegantly dressed guests moved between displays celebrating local charities, educational programs, and community art projects. Waiters carried sparkling water and small desserts through conversations that seemed to belong to a world far removed from her own. Grace reminded herself she was simply there to support the bookstore and quietly wandered toward an exhibit featuring children's literacy initiatives. She paused to admire several student paintings when a familiar voice behind her said, "I had a feeling green would be your color." Grace turned so quickly that she nearly laughed out loud. Ethan stood only a few feet away wearing a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that transformed him in a way she had never seen before. He still smiled exactly the same, but everything else about him suddenly seemed different. "You clean up pretty well for a technology consultant," she teased. Ethan chuckled, although a hint of nervousness crossed his face. "You look beautiful tonight." Grace felt warmth rise to her cheeks. "Thank you." They spent several comfortable minutes exploring the exhibits together, talking about paintings, local artists, and the importance of community libraries. Yet Grace noticed something unusual. People constantly greeted Ethan as they walked past. Some nodded respectfully. Others smiled with obvious admiration. A few even seemed intimidated. Each time someone approached, Ethan politely redirected the conversation before introducing Grace only by her first name. She assumed he simply knew more people in the technology industry than she realized. Eventually, an event coordinator hurried toward them carrying a tablet. "Mr. Walker," she said with visible relief, "everyone is ready backstage. We begin in 2 minutes." Grace looked at Ethan with puzzled curiosity. "Backstage?" Ethan hesitated. For the first time since they had met, words seemed difficult for him to find. "Grace, there is something I have wanted to explain." Before he could continue, the ballroom lights gradually dimmed, and guests began taking their seats. The master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage as applause filled the room. Ethan looked toward the stage, then back at Grace. "Please let me explain afterward," he said quietly. She nodded, still confused, and watched him walk away with the coordinator. Moments later, the large screen behind the stage illuminated with photographs of technology centers, scholarship programs, community projects, and disaster relief initiatives funded across the country. The audience applauded enthusiastically as the presenter smiled toward the crowd. "Tonight we honor a leader whose vision has transformed not only the technology industry, but countless communities across America through education, innovation, and generosity. Please join me in welcoming the founder and chief executive officer of Walker Innovations, billionaire philanthropist Ethan Walker." The applause became thunderous as Ethan stepped confidently onto the stage beneath bright lights. Grace felt every sound inside the ballroom disappear. Her heartbeat seemed louder than the applause surrounding her. She stared at the giant screen displaying his name, his company, and headlines celebrating one of the youngest billionaires in the country. Memories rushed through her mind with overwhelming clarity. The rainy sidewalk, the bookstore, coffee in the park, the sketch she had given him. Every conversation about ordinary life. Every answer that had carefully avoided the truth. Ethan began thanking the audience for supporting community programs, but Grace could barely hear his words anymore. It was not his wealth that stunned her. It was the realization that the man she had slowly come to trust had never truly introduced himself. As Ethan spoke about using success to create opportunities for others, his eyes searched the audience until they found Grace standing perfectly still near the back of the ballroom. Their eyes met across the crowded room. His expression held no pride, only quiet regret. Grace gently tightened her fingers around the strap of her purse before slowly turning away. Without a single word, she walked toward the ballroom doors, carrying with her a heart suddenly filled with questions she had never imagined needing to ask. The cold evening air greeted Grace the moment she stepped outside the hotel, carrying with it the distant sounds of traffic and the salty breeze drifting in from Boston Harbor. The excitement inside the ballroom faded behind the heavy doors, replaced by a silence that felt almost impossible to bear. She walked slowly down the wide stone steps without knowing where she intended to go. Her emerald dress brushed lightly against the pavement while the city lights blurred through unexpected tears gathering in her eyes. It was not because Ethan was wealthy. She had never believed money made anyone more valuable. What hurt was something far quieter. Every meaningful conversation they had shared suddenly felt incomplete. Every answer he had given now carried another hidden layer she had never been invited to see. She reached the quiet waterfront several blocks away before finally stopping beside the railing overlooking the dark water. The gentle waves reflected hundreds of lights dancing across the harbor, but tonight even the beautiful view could not settle the questions inside her heart. A few minutes later, steady footsteps approached from behind. Grace. She recognized his voice immediately, but did not turn around. Ethan stopped several feet away, giving her the space she silently asked for. Neither of them spoke for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Grace broke the silence. How long? She asked softly. Ethan lowered his eyes. From the beginning. She nodded almost imperceptibly. So every time I asked what you did, every time I asked about your life, you already knew you were leaving out the biggest part. Ethan took a slow breath. Yes. Grace closed her eyes for a moment before speaking again. Do you know what hurts the most? Ethan looked toward her with quiet regret. It is not that you are a billionaire. It is not the company. It is not the headlines. Her voice trembled slightly before becoming steady again. It is that I trusted you enough to hand you my sketchbook. I trusted you with my dreams. I even gave you the drawing I never would have given anyone else. But somehow you never trusted me with your name. Ethan felt every word settle heavily inside him because he knew she was right. There was no clever explanation waiting to fix what had already happened. I wanted you to know me before everything else, he answered honestly. I was afraid that once you learned who I was, every conversation would change. Grace turned toward him for the first time. You made that decision for both of us. Ethan could not deny it. The silence between them stretched once more. Cars passed in the distance while the harbor remained calm beneath the evening sky. Grace looked at him with sadness rather than anger. Do you know why I never asked how much money you made? She continued. Because I already liked the man who drank coffee in the park, who listened instead of interrupting, who smiled when I talked about drawings nobody else cared about. I never needed anything else. Ethan's voice became almost a whisper. That man was real. Grace nodded slowly. I believe he was. But he was never the whole truth. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket and carefully removed the folded sketch she had given him beneath the maple tree. The edges had become slightly worn from being carried every day. I never left home without this, he said quietly. Whenever meetings became overwhelming or success started feeling empty, I looked at this drawing because it reminded me of the person I wanted to be. Grace looked at the sketch for only a second before lowering her eyes again. It still hurt to know that something so meaningful had existed beside a secret she never saw coming. Ethan stepped no closer. I am not asking you to forgive me tonight, he said. I only want you to know that every conversation we shared mattered to me. None of it was pretend. Grace wrapped her arms around herself as another cool breeze crossed the harbor. Maybe that is what makes this so difficult. She smiled sadly. If you had been pretending, walking away would be easy. Ethan remained silent, allowing her honesty to settle between them. After several moments, Grace reached into her purse and touched the folded note written by her father years ago. Keep drawing. Someone will see your work someday. She realized she still believed those words. What she no longer knew was whether she could believe Ethan with the same certainty. She looked back toward the glowing hotel where applause still echoed faintly beyond the windows before meeting his eyes one last time. I need time, she said gently. Not because you are rich. Because trust cannot be rebuilt in a single conversation. Ethan nodded with complete understanding. Take all the time you need. Grace offered one small, grateful smile before quietly walking away into the Boston night, leaving Ethan standing alone beside the harbor, finally understanding that the hardest distance to cross was never measured in miles or fortunes, but in the quiet space between truth withheld and trust once freely given. The days that followed were unusually quiet, and for the first time since they had met, Harbor Page's bookstore felt a little larger and a little lonelier to Grace. Thursday came and went without the familiar brass bell announcing Ethan's arrival. No thoughtful conversations drifted through the aisles. No coffee waited beside her favorite bench in the park. She told herself that distance was necessary, yet every ordinary routine reminded her of someone who had quietly become part of it. She immersed herself in work, recommended novels with the same warm smile, and continued filling her sketchbook, but she never touched the blank page she had been saving. It remained untouched, patiently waiting for a moment she still could not define. Across the city, Ethan had also changed his routine. Instead of trying to call Grace or appearing unexpectedly at the bookstore, he respected the promise he had made beside the harbor. If trust was going to return, it could not be forced. Yet doing nothing did not mean giving up. One evening, he unlocked a vacant brick warehouse that Walker Innovations had quietly purchased months earlier for storage. Sunlight streamed through enormous factory windows, illuminating wide wooden floors and tall white walls. His executive team expected the building to become another technology incubator. Ethan had something entirely different in mind. Over the next several weeks, architects, local artists, community volunteers, and nonprofit organizations began working together under Ethan's personal direction. Every decision reflected details Grace had shared during their conversations. Natural light instead of harsh office lighting. Comfortable reading corners beside gallery walls. Free workshops for children and adults. Local artists featured alongside first-time creators. A small cafe serving affordable coffee rather than luxury dining. Above the entrance, one simple phrase was carefully engraved into reclaimed oak. Never stop becoming yourself. The sentence Grace had once written on a tiny piece of paper quietly became the heart of the entire project. Ethan never attached his own name to the building. He wanted the place to speak louder than any press release ever could. Meanwhile, Grace received an unexpected invitation addressed personally to her at the bookstore. The elegant cream-colored envelope contained only a handwritten note. There were no company logos, no signatures, and no explanation. It simply read, "There is something I would like you to see." No speeches, no expectations, just the truth. Saturday at 2 o'clock. Curiosity wrestled gently with hesitation for several days before Grace finally decided to go. On Saturday afternoon, she followed the address to a renovated warehouse in the city's historic arts district. Colorful banners fluttered outside while families, students, painters, musicians, and neighborhood residents filled the sidewalk with quiet excitement. A volunteer welcomed visitors with a warm smile and handed Grace a small brochure. She looked down at the cover and immediately stopped walking. It read, "The Grace Mitchell Community Art and Story Center." Her breath caught before she slowly looked up at the restored building standing proudly before her. Inside, sunlight poured across polished wooden floors exactly as she had once described in one of their conversations. Shelves overflowed with donated books. Easels lined bright studios where aspiring artists quietly worked together. One wall displayed drawings submitted by local children beside paintings created by retired veterans and first-time artists who had never before shown their work publicly. Grace walked slowly through every room, unable to speak. Near the center of the gallery stood a familiar wooden display case. Inside rested a simple roll of heavy-duty tape beside a handwritten card. "The first act of kindness built this place. Thank you for reminding someone that temporary solutions can become permanent hope." Tears quietly filled Grace's eyes as memories of the rainy afternoon returned with unexpected clarity. "Hey." Volunteer approached with another small envelope. "This was left for you," she said gently. Grace unfolded the letter and immediately recognized Ethan's handwriting. "I finally understood what you meant when you said people remember kindness. I spent years building companies. You reminded me that building people matters more. This place does not exist to impress you. It exists because you changed the way I measure success long before you ever knew my last name. If you never wish to see me again, this center will still belong to the community exactly as promised. But if someday you believe trust deserves another chance, I will be waiting in the little reading garden behind the building." Grace folded the letter carefully and slipped it beside her father's note inside her purse. She walked through the final hallway toward a quiet courtyard where autumn flowers surrounded wooden benches and young maple trees. Standing beneath one of those trees, Wearing the same navy jacket he had worn on the day they first met in the bookstore, Ethan looked up as she entered. Neither of them spoke immediately. They did not need to. Everything that had once been hidden was now visible, not through wealth or grand announcements, but through a promise quietly transformed into a place where thousands of ordinary dreams would finally have room to grow. Grace stood quietly beneath the young maple tree, holding Ethan's letter against her heart, while the gentle sounds of laughter drifted from the community art center behind them. Families explored the galleries, children discovered shelves filled with books, and first-time artists admired paintings they had finally found the courage to display. Everything around her felt alive because someone had listened to every dream she had once spoken, as if it were ordinary conversation. Ethan took one careful step forward but stopped well before reaching her. "Thank you for coming," he said softly. Grace looked around the peaceful garden before meeting his eyes again. "I almost did not." He nodded. "I would have understood." A quiet breeze stirred the maple leaves overhead. Neither of them seemed in a hurry to fill the silence. Finally, Grace smiled. Faintly. "You remembered everything." Ethan followed her gaze toward the building. "Not everything. Only the things that mattered most." She held up the folded letter. "You built all of this because of one conversation?" He shook his head gently. "No. I built it because of dozens of conversations. Every time you spoke about art, books, community, or people who simply needed someone to believe in them, I realized I had spent years solving problems with money when I should have been creating opportunities with trust." Grace looked back toward the entrance where visitors continued arriving with excited smiles. "You could have put your company name on the building." Ethan smiled. "That would have defeated the purpose." She laughed quietly for the first time in weeks. "You really have changed." Ethan answered with complete honesty. "I think I finally became the person you believed I already was." Grace felt the weight she had carried since the gala began to lift. She remembered the rainy afternoon when she had spent her last few dollars on a roll of tape for a stranger. She remembered lending him her sketchbook, handing him a simple drawing, writing 5 words on a scrap of paper, and believing kindness was meant to keep moving from one person to another. None of those moments had been wasted. They had quietly become the foundation of something much larger than either of them had imagined. She reached into her purse and slowly removed her sketchbook. The worn cover carried years of hopes, disappointments, and unfinished dreams. Opening it carefully, she turned page after page until she reached the one sheet that had remained blank from the very beginning. Ethan recognized it immediately, but said nothing. Grace looked down at the untouched paper and smiled through gentle tears. "I kept waiting for the moment that would change my life," she whispered. "I thought it would happen all at once." She lifted her pencil and began drawing. Her hand moved calmly across the page, capturing the arts center, the maple tree, and one man standing patiently without asking for forgiveness he had not yet earned. Sentence beneath it: "The best stories begin with kindness and grow with truth." She carefully tore the page from the sketchbook and handed it to Ethan. "This one belongs to both of us." Ethan accepted it with the same quiet respect he had shown every drawing she had ever trusted him with. "Does this mean?" He began gently. Grace stepped closer and smiled. "It means I believe trust can be rebuilt when actions become stronger than words." Relief softened Ethan's expression. From his jacket pocket, he removed a small velvet box. But instead of opening it immediately, he looked at her with the same sincerity she had first seen beside a rain-soaked sidewalk. "Grace, I do not want to promise you a perfect life because neither of us believes perfect lives exist. But I can promise honesty every single day. No more hidden names. No more missing truths. Just me." Grace nodded, her eyes shining with quiet certainty. Ethan opened the box to reveal a simple diamond ring set on a classic gold band, elegant without excess. "Will you spend your life reminding me to keep becoming myself?" he asked. Grace laughed softly through happy tears before answering the easiest question she had ever heard. "Yes, as long as you remind me to keep drawing." A year later, the Grace Mitchell Community Art and Story Center had become one of Boston's most beloved gathering places. Thousands of visitors walked through its doors, discovering books, creativity, friendship, and hope without ever needing to know the remarkable story behind its beginning. Grace finally opened her own illustration studio inside the center, mentoring young artists who doubted their own talent just as she once had. Ethan continued leading his company, but everyone who worked beside him noticed the difference. Success was no longer measured only by innovation or profit, but by the opportunities created for others. On a quiet spring afternoon, they returned to the very sidewalk where a loose bumper panel, a roll of tape, and one simple act of kindness had first brought two strangers together. Standing there hand in hand, Grace smiled and said, "Funny how temporary solutions sometimes last forever." Ethan looked at her with grateful eyes and replied, "Only when someone brave enough chooses kindness before they know the ending." And together they walked forward, knowing the greatest fortune either of them would ever possess had never been measured by wealth at all, but by the simple courage to see the person standing in front of them before seeing anything else.